Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about this claim that bad technique doesn't exist, which, by the way, yes, a lot of people do say this. I hear this almost on a daily or at least a weekly basis. And we're going to talk about why this claim is silly, what technique actually is because it's important to define it, and what might define good technique. So first of all, just to sort of debunk this claim with some very simple logic, if you make the claim that bad technique doesn't exist, then simultaneously what you're also saying is that good technique doesn't exist, meaning that, if I wanted to, go and grow my biceps in the gym, I could just do a leg extension and it doesn't really matter because, again, if you say there's no bad technique, then you've defined no constraints around which that goal might actually be accomplished. So put very simply, if you don't have one end of the spectrum, you also don't have the other end of the spectrum. If you just eliminate the spectrum altogether, then there's really nothing to talk about, right? So very simply, I think it's a silly thing to say, but what do people actually mean when they say bad technique doesn't exist? Well, maybe they mean that there's no one technique for everyone. And I think that that's 100% true. We're all individuals. But on some level, we still can define, broadly speaking, constraints of an exercise, specifically as it relates to a goal, to define what good technique might actually look like. So how do we actually begin to do that? Well, again, we have to start by defining technique. So I just came up with this sort of very simple definition, which says technique refers to the set of physical properties of an exercise setup and execution that differentiates it from other exercises. So what does that really mean in simpler terms? Well, to me, it just means that to talk about technique is to define how and why you perform a specific exercise in a specific way. And as I mentioned before, technique, good or bad, needs to be goal defined, right? So we have to have something that we're trying to accomplish. And then we can start to create constraints around what might better accomplish that goal or what might not accomplish that goal as effectively. And again, some of you may be thinking, well, duh, right? But this is sort of the simple logic, I think, that sort of breaks apart this idea that there's no good technique, right? There's clearly something to that claim in terms of, again, that whole individual conversation. But I think the claim that bad technique doesn't exist is really missing the mark in terms of what we're actually trying to communicate. So after we sort of define technique, what do these things called physical properties really mean? What are the constituent parts of what I mean by physical properties? Well, firstly, again, it's goal defined. So let's just come up with a goal. Let's say I'm trying to grow my biceps. Okay, everyone loves to grow biceps or elbow flexors, right? If you're an anatomy nerd and you know that more muscles other than the biceps flex or bend the elbow. Well, the first thing I need to do is I need to identify the primarily involved joint. So what do I mean by this parenthetical primarily thing here? Well, if I'm doing a biceps curl, right, I'm loading my elbow primarily, meaning that my elbow is the primary moving joint of the exercise. I think everyone knows that just sort of intuitively, that to grow biceps, you got to do some kind of curling thing. But let's talk about what actually constrains that. Well, again, if you're loading the elbow, you have to somewhat, to some degree, if you're holding something, you have to load the wrist, you have to load all of the different muscles in your fingers, and you also have to load the shoulder and, technically speaking, the rest of your body, right? But the primarily involved joints we'll call are the joints of the forearm and the joints of the elbow. So identify the moving joints or the primarily involved moving joints. And then from there, we can identify the constraints not only around the joint specifically, in other words, the structure of the joint, right? So if we can talk about the elbow, we can talk about the fact that the elbow is a hinge joint, right? And all the different properties that sort of compose a hinge joint and what makes that unique as compared to maybe a ball and socket or a gliding joint or a condyloid joint, right, et cetera. And then we can also talk about the setup, meaning that, if I'm going to do a curl, maybe let's say a preacher curl, I can define the physical constraints not only inside my body that I'm having to deal with, but also outside of my body. So, a lot of people will put something behind the bottom of the upper arm, the bottom of the humerus, to support their arm because they know that if they want their elbow to be a limiter, right, in the motion, right, muscles that surround the elbow, then we know that we don't want muscles around the wrist or around the fingers or around the shoulder or even the trunk to be the limiters of that motion, right? So we identify the moving joints, the primary moving joints. We identify the constraints, both in terms of joint type, muscle architecture as well, ligamentous structure potentially as well, if you want to go there, and then also the physical constraints of the setup. And then in addition to that, we can identify the appropriate contact points, meaning where I need to hold something, which again, all this may be like overly obvious to some of you, but in the case of a curl at least, but if you're trying to do something more specific that may be a little bit more difficult for you to understand, like a lot of the muscles around the hips or the spine may be a little bit intuitively less accessible in terms of our understanding of them, we need to identify contact points, i.e., in the case of a curl, loading my hand or loading something along my forearm if I have a strap for my forearm. And then the direction of resistance, right? So what differentiates a biceps exercise from a triceps exercise? The direction of resistance, right? So we need to keep those things in mind as sort of the primary points after we've identified the joints and their structure and then the surrounding setup. We can sort of start to talk about resistance and resistance direction. Now, resistance profiles and all that stuff gets a little bit more nuanced, but I think this is a good starting point for, again, just broadly defining the physical properties that sort of compose technique. And then after that, if you've seen my video, it's a recent video a day or two ago that I put out on range of motion, we can identify the range of motion that would be most useful for targeting the specific muscle that we're trying to train. So, for example, if you are trying to target, let's say, like your pecs on a bench press, it might behoove you, it might benefit you not to use the full range of motion of the implement, which would be fully locking out, and maybe touching your chest, right? So the range of motion, and this is again sort of a different tangential conversation, also needs to be goal defined, right? Which again is just a subset, is just a conversation underneath of the umbrella of what we mean by technique, right? So again, all of this is really just defining constraints to achieve a particular goal. And if you think that good technique doesn't exist, then you have no ability to actually define these constraints. And at a further level, you have no ability, as a consequence of that, to assess whether these constraints are more aligned with what you're trying to do or less aligned with what you're trying to do. So I think that overall in this conversation of good versus bad technique, again, we need to kind of just bring it back to this conversation of, what are the physical properties that would sort of move us in the direction of the goal. But if you're unable to identify those physical properties and what the constraints of a particular exercise might need to be for you to accomplish that particular goal, then we can't really have this conversation at all. And I think ironically, the same people that are talking about this idea that bad technique doesn't exist, and again, as a consequence or by product of that, good technique not existing, are simply just unable to really identify these physical properties that might move them in the direction of being more aligned with a goal or less aligned with a goal. So the next time that you hear someone saying, good technique doesn't exist, you can really ask them, do you really mean that good technique doesn't exist, or do you just mean that technique may be an individualized thing, which of course it is, everyone understands that, because those are very different things. So I think, as an industry, we need to move more in the direction of let's actually dig into the weeds here and talk about what we mean by these words that just get thrown around, like technique and like goal. Like, what do we even mean by goal? Right? We have specific aims in the gym, and hopefully we're not aimless, right? Because if we're aimless, we don't have any sort of map within which we can sort of operate to achieve our goals. We need to define these things first before we can actually start to talk about whether or not we're more aligned again or less aligned with a particular goal of an exercise. If you like this video and you want to learn more from me, please consider enrolling in my online anatomy and biomechanics course. The course contains over 15 hours specifically dedicated to improving your understanding of anatomy and physics and how it applies to lifting weights. Over 3,000 students have enrolled in this course and have reported back that it's the most easy to digest material that doesn't include any sort of boring textbook lecture that you might normally find in a typical college curriculum. So if you want to improve your ability to lift and as a consequence, grow muscle more easily and reduce your pain in the gym, check out the link in the description.